Welcome to our lesson about sketch options. In this lesson, we'll be learning about configuring and customizing your sketch environment via the Application Options dialog window on the Tools tab, Options panel. The Application Options dialog window is where we make changes to default settings in our installation of the Inventor software. And we're going to be working on the Sketch tab in this lesson. The first section concerns 2D sketch options. Constraint Placement Priority. We've got two options here, parallel and perpendicular, and horizontal and vertical. When you're sketching, Inventor often places constraints automatically based upon the existing geometry. This is called constraint inference, i.e., Inventor infers and places the constraints. By default, the parallel and perpendicular option is selected. This method looks for relationships between geometry before looking at the coordinates of the sketch grid. The horizontal and vertical option works differently. First, it looks at the coordinate system to determine the placement of constraints. That is, it'll infer a constraint as horizontal or vertical rather than as perpendicular or parallel. Let's just take a moment to check out how this works. Cancel out of the Applicant Options dialog window, and let's close this open document. You'll remember that if I try to close a document while I'm in sketch mode, I'll be prompted to first exit sketch mode and then save the part file. I closed this document to avoid the inference of constraints to the existing geometry in that sketch. We'll work with a new part document, and we're in sketch mode. Let's activate the line tool. Let's place a vertical line. Left-click to place the first point. You don't need to hold the mouse down while you drag. Notice the constraint glyph near the cursor. That's the vertical constraint glyph. If I left-click while this is visible, then Inventor will infer and place that constraint. So let's do that. Let's left-click to place our second point and accept the constraint. Now let's exit the line tool by pressing Escape, and let's activate the display of constraints. There's the vertical glyph. Let's pin it down and activate the line tool again. Now we're going to draw a horizontal line. See that green dot that appeared when I moused over the end point of the line? If I left-click now to place my first point of the second line on this point, Inventor will infer and place a coincident constraint. Let's do that. There's my first point. Notice that when my dragging is horizontal, the perpendicular glyph appears near the cursor. If I left-click while this glyph displays, then I will accept the perpendicular relationship that Inventor is inferring here. Let's do that. Left-click to place the point and accept the perpendicular relation. Let's show the glyph now. Press F8 to show all constraints. Here's the inferred perpendicular constraint, the vertical constraint we've already talked about. There's another constraint here that was inferred. This is the origin point, and this, as you may recall, we opted to project automatically in new parts. Let's go back to the Tools tab, Application Options. Now let's try the same exercise using the horizontal and vertical option. Apply and close. Back to the Sketch tab now. See how it's in green? That means we haven't finished the sketch yet, even though we went to another tab. First, we'll place a vertical line. Left-click to place the first point. Left-click to place the second point while the vertical constraint glyph displays. Mouse over the start point of the line. There's the coincident relation dot, and the glyph appears near the cursor. Left-click to place. Drag, and left-click to place our second point. Notice that the horizontal glyph is riding next to the cursor. Let's display all constraints. And let's take a look at these new constraints. Before we show all constraints, we're going to need to exit the line tool, right-click, and done. Now press F8, and here are the new constraints inferred, vertical and horizontal. Okay, let's return to the Tools tab, Application Options window. Let's look at some of these other options here. Let's take a look at the Display section. Check here to make grid lines visible. Let's uncheck this box and click Apply. Now the grid lines have disappeared. Let's restore the grid lines. Uncheck the minor grid lines and apply. Now we've got the major grid lines but no minor grid lines. And let's uncheck axes and grid lines, apply. Okay, let's restore all of the grid lines and axes. The coordinate system indicator, that's the red and green arrows indicating the X and Y axes. You see it in the bottom left corner. If you check this box, you'll see it at the origin point as well. You might be wondering where we go to make changes to the sizing of the sketch grid. Here we only hide and show its display. The sketch grid is based upon the units of measurement that you've selected, and that is determined at the file level. We do that in the Document Options window rather than in the Application Options interface. Display coincident constraints on creation. This is unchecked, and that's why we didn't see the coincident constraints when we showed the relations. You'll recall that Inventor did infer the coincident constraint when I hovered the mouse over one of the line points. Hiding the coincident constraints makes it a little bit easier to look at the Show All Relations view. Otherwise, that view can get too crowded with the coincident constraints that appear at every vertex. The coincident and DOF symbol scale. DOF stands for degrees of freedom. Basically, these numbers control the size of our glyph. The bigger the number, the bigger the glyph. Here's what they look like a little bit larger. Let's return to their default setting of 1.0 and apply. Let's drag the Application Options window back so you can see the left-hand side again. Let's talk about Overconstrained Dimensions. When we've got an overconstrained dimension, we have two options. We can automatically apply a driven dimension, or we can ask Inventor to warn of the overconstrained condition. At that point, we're able to decide what to do, either to accept the driving dimension or to apply the driven dimension. When your sketch is overconstrained, it means there's too many dimensions and constraints. And that's a problem because Inventor needs to know which dimension or constraint to use in its calculations of your model. We covered this in our first lesson on sketching. Dimensions can be what's called driving. This means that they're used to calculate geometry. If they're not driving, then they're driven, and this means that they're resized based on Inventor's calculations of other dimensions. By the way, in your graphic area, driven dimensions are easily distinguished because they appear within parentheses. And you'll recall that while you're in sketch mode, you are able to turn a driving dimension into a driven dimension if you need to. Now let's talk about the next option, Spline Fit Method. We've got three options: Standard, AutoCAD, and Minimum Energy. The Standard method creates a spline with what's called smooth continuity. This is suitable for Class A surfaces such as automotive design. The AutoCAD option creates a spline using the AutoCAD Fit method. It's not suitable for Class A surfaces, and the continuity is not as smooth. The third option, Minimum Energy, is suitable for Class A surfaces. But this third type takes longer to calculate and creates a larger file. When you activate this option, the slider becomes available. You use this to adjust the tightness or looseness of a spline. Adjust upward for a tighter spline. We'll be reviewing these ideas in more detail in our lesson on splines later in this course. Now let's talk about the options at the bottom of this window, and some of these we've come across already in our course. Snap to Grid. This option makes the cursor snap to your grid lines. If this option is unchecked, your cursor won't snap to grid lines at all. Edit Dimension when created. This launches the Edit Dimension dialog box so that you can manually input the dimension size at the time when you create the dimension. You don't have to double-click on the dimension to edit it. Auto-project edges during curve creation. If you check this box, you can just rub your mouse over an entity that you want projected into your current sketch. We're going to leave this option unchecked for now. Auto-project edges for sketch creation and edit. If you create a sketch on an existing face of your part, this option projects the geometry of the face onto your current sketch. I'm going to leave this option unchecked for now. If I do need to project anything soon, I'm going to use the Project Geometry tool on the Draw panel of the Sketch tab. Our next option is Look at Sketch Plane on Sketch Creation. If you check this option, your graphic area will be oriented perpendicular to the sketch plane when you launch a new sketch. Let's check this option. Auto Project Part Origin on Sketch Create. We spoke about this briefly. This automatically projects a part's origin point when you insert a new sketch. The origin point has coordinates 0, 0, 0 on the X, Y, and Z axes. Projecting the origin point makes it easier to constrain your sketch. If you don't check this option, you'll need to manually project the origin point. The last option is Point Alignment. This lets endpoints and midpoints be inferred. Dotted lines will appear to guide you. I would suggest checking this option. It generally makes it easier to find midpoints. For 3D sketch, we've got one option, Auto Bend with 3D line creation. If you check this box, corners will be automatically rounded rather than given 90-degree edges. Again, this only applies to 3D sketches. Checking this option here will enable the rounding of the corners. However, we do set the sizing in the Document Options window. The heads-up display from the Sketch tab of the Application Options window. You've seen the heads-up display many times in this course already. Let's just try to make some room in the graphic area so we can see it. Actually, let's just close the Application Options window. That'll be a bit easier. Let's return to the Sketch tab and activate the line command. Near my cursor, you see the current values of the X and Y coordinates as I drag the mouse. I'm also able to input right into these boxes to manually set my coordinates. This function is known as the pointer input of the heads-up display. Now that I've placed my point, I'm currently able to dimension it in polar coordinates. I enter a distance value here, and then I enter a degree value in the next box. Let's get back to the Application Options window. Tools tab, Application Options. Now let's click on the Settings button of the heads-up display. Check here to enable pointer input. This lets me manually input coordinate values on the X and Y axes. It's currently set to Cartesian coordinates. On the right-hand side of the window, I check the Enable Dimension Input where possible. This lets me immediately apply dimensions once I've placed a point. It's currently set in polar coordinates. We can, of course, switch it to Cartesian coordinates. We're going to cover the heads-up display options in greater detail later in this course. You need to click Apply if you've made any changes. This dialog window is a little long, so you won't be able to see that in this video. There's a couple other options down at the bottom of this window. You're also able to import and export your sketch settings via an XML file. This is handy if, for example, you've messed something up and you want to go back to Inventor's default options. You would just click Import. Inventor navigates you automatically to the appropriate folder, and then you can launch the Inventor default options file. Let's cancel out of this window for now. And let's close the Application Options dialog window. Okay, let's exit this tool by clicking Escape. Let's return to the Sketch tab. We're currently on the Tools tab. Let's click the big green Finish Sketch checkmark. And this concludes our first lesson on sketch options. In our next lesson, we're going to pick up the sketch settings in the Document Options window.